Welcome to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. This episode is part of our Indies Introduced series, where we spotlight debut authors handpicked by booksellers from around the country. In each episode, a bookseller from the Indies Introduced panel will interview the author of a debut title featured in our program.
Hi, I'm Stephen Sparks, owner of Point Reyes Books in Northern California, and it's a real pleasure to be here today with Sophie Elmhirst to talk about her Indies Introduced selection, Marriage at Sea. I'm going to rave about the book in a moment after introducing Sophie, but Sophie Elmhirst is an award-winning journalist who writes regularly for The Guardian Long Read and The Economist. Her work has also appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker, and Harper's Bazaar, among other places. She's the winner of the British Press Award for Feature Writer of the Year and a Foreign Press Award. She lives in London, and A Marriage at Sea is her first book. So, Sophie, this was a book that, among the reading stood out. It was so unique in its approach and its subject matter, and it really kind of cut through, for me as a reader, a lot of sort of stereotypical Lost at Sea kind of nautical adventure stories, because it does so much more that's interesting, that I found, in a genre that I imagine, and I want to talk about this in a little bit, that is difficult. The book really, like I said, kind of cut through across genres in a lot of ways. It does so many interesting things. So Sophie, instead of me just raving, I want to ask you right away, like, how were you introduced to this story of Maurice and Marilyn? Am I saying her name correctly, Marilyn?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
And did their story hook you as quickly as it did for me as a reader of your book?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you don't come across stories like this very often, especially ones that you feel like haven't been told or you didn't know. I couldn't believe when I came across a story that it wasn't one that was kind of in, I don't know, sort of common legend or like the collective consciousness. It just seemed strange to me that their story had been so forgotten. I'm a journalist in my kind of day job, so I'm always hunting for stories in different ways. And it was one of just those profoundly lucky things that I was researching a particular piece on people trying to escape the land. It was kind of COVID time and people trying to make lives on sea in different ways. And I just literally sort of stumbled upon their story on a website devoted to castaways, actually, and shipwreck stories. And among all these sort of images of grizzled looking kind of lone men, there was this little photo of a man and a woman, and she caught my eye because she was sort of felt quite unusual in that setting. And yeah, as I say, when I sort of dug a little deeper and found out more, I sort of couldn't believe it had been sort of as forgotten as it had been. And I guess probably it hooked me in the way it probably hooks in. I hope it hooks in, readers quite quickly, which is just the sheer extremity and drama and like insanity of the situation in which they find themselves, which is adrift in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, their boat having sunk and been hit by a whale. But actually, the thing that made me think I could write a book about it were both them as individual characters, and their relationship. Once I knew that there was enough material to sort of excavate their relationship, then that's what made me think, I think this could be the kind of book I'd actually like to write.
I can imagine as a journalist and a writer that you felt like, wow, jackpot. I have stumbled upon something here.
It did feel like that. This happens so rarely, obviously, as to feel, I don't mind sort of admitting that it felt like the jackpot, because, rarely do you come across amazing stories, but then you find that there's no material, or you find that someone else has done it, or someone else is in the process of doing it. And I just I knew that they'd written books, and those were kind of easy to come by, but I hardly met anyone that remembered them or had heard or even read their books. Now I have met more people. Now my book is sort of out in the world, but yeah, it just felt incredibly lucky. And then also to find this wealth of material just sort of beneath the surface, not just the things that they'd written, but, media coverage of their rescue, and lots of surviving friends and family, and diaries and photographs, and there was just so much to draw on, and that was the thing that felt incredibly fortunate, I think, because that's not always the case at all.
Yeah. And the one thing that I found really, I mean, among many things I found very intriguing in the book, is, I mean, both, the sort of the aspect of the story that is the adventure, that is, being lost at sea, and that is that kind of harrowing travail. But the way that you bring both their personal and interpersonal dynamics alive. Like, this is as much a story of a marriage and a relationship and how we deal with people as it is, just a straightforward, nautical tale. And so I wonder what was it about their dynamic that really kind of hooked you in as well?
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. And it was, I mean, they were such a marriage of contrast in a way. And as soon as I sort of found out more about them and talked to people about them, the sense of almost mystification that would come from people who knew and loved them well of how they came to be together in the first place. And that was sort of fascinating to me that, even the people nearest to them couldn't quite understand their relationship. So that sort of made me want to understand it all the more. And I think as like the way they, particularly Morris, sort of does analyze their relationship and sort of often to his own detriment, and we'll sort of say that it was really Marilyn that kind of got him through and that supported him, and certainly when they're sort of drifting around on the life raft. But they were such extraordinarily different people in the way they related to the world and other people, crucially. He was this sort of quite awkward and lonely man before he met her, living quite a kind of dislocated life. And she was this live wire and such a sort of compelling, energetic, positive presence. And something about just the sort of fact of how a marriage like that works, but then you putting that marriage in this sort of extreme sort of scenario into the ultimate test. And I suppose there was something really I found to be just universal about that. I suppose the best stories I feel like are ones that are highly specific and in this case very extreme, but that have some sort of universal resonance. And I felt like, well, we all know what it is to kind of hit crunch points or to have face crises with a partner or with a friend or whoever a significant other is, and what that does to a relationship, what that does to you as an individual, what it reveals to you about yourself, but also about that other person. It just sort of felt like a kind of incredibly rich sort of field of material, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of an experiment in a way, I would think. You put these two people who in normal life, things can be kind of flat in a way, right? Even in relationships, there's a dynamic obviously that changes, but you put them in heightened circumstances and kind of like, let's see what happens. And this book is let's see what happens. It really shows
Right.
in that way.
Yeah, no, totally.
Well, then I sort of wonder, again, a story about, anyone being lost at sea is kind of inherently compelling, I think, because I think a lot of us just sort of, you can extrapolate and kind of imagine yourself and, what it would be like to be there and, and writing it. But I imagine then writing it is actually somewhat difficult, because you only have so much to work with. But you, as a writer who are obviously interested in craft, like, you do something really interesting in the book. Um, and I wonder, like, how you thought through the craft component to kind of maintain the tension in the book.
Mm,
I mean, some of it's inherently there, as you said, between
mm.
these two and the circumstances. But in the telling, I think what comes across in the book is that it does maintain this like taut narrative tension throughout, and that is so compelling as a reader.
Oh, well, that's good to know because it's not always obvious. And there was certain, I guess, I don't know how much is conscious and how much is sort of instinct. I think it's very obvious. I suppose there was one way of telling this story, which would have maybe been the more obvious way, and certainly according to some of the comments on the internet, is possibly the way that they would have preferred, which is just that it's them adrift and you end with the rescue and it's a happy ending and job done kind of thing. And that was never the sort of story I wanted to tell. I did want to kind of complicate it and extend it and give a sense of just their whole lives, from childhood and them meeting right to the end of their lives, somehow without losing that tension and that sense of sort of propulsion. And I don't know. I think I've said this before, but it's true. I read more fiction than nonfiction, and I sort of wanted to try. I mean, and there's plenty of nonfiction that has done this already, and that was an inspiration to me. But to try and write a piece of nonfiction that had some of those I don't know, great sort of devices and attributes of good fiction, which is a sort of sense of narrative propulsion, which is a sense of character, of being and of interiority, of like going with people through something and coming, reaching a different point with them, rather than I think what you can sometimes have in nonfiction, which is a sense of the author's kind of on high and sort of, sort of or it being an argument, essentially a sort of point of argument. I just want it to be a story, and to try and sort of marshal the material I had into sort of story form. And so I guess that in terms of how I did that, or the sort of craft point of that, it was a lot of that was just a mission, not including things and trying not to be distracted by too many things. There's so many kind of rabbit holes and tunnels I could have gone down, and did go down in the research of, I don't know, that part of the ocean, or what sperm whales, how they live, I don't know, all sorts of stuff like that. You could have easily crowded it out, and I guess I just tried, and I don't think always succeeded, but I tried certainly to be quite disciplined about keeping the focus quite sort of narrow, and sort of driven by the sort of the characters themselves. So yeah, that was the intention in any case.
It succeeds. It does succeed very well. I think the close narration, and actually, and it kind of muddles things in a bit, that it does feel, when you read that you're reading a book from someone whose day job as a journalist, you kind of think you're going to get one kind of narrative, and then you read this, and it feels like it's somewhere between fact and fiction, and all of this, obviously, you're marshaling these facts for this end, but the craft component to me was really one of the more compelling parts, and that kind of leads to my next question about, sort of the kind of traditional tropes of these kind of stories are male heavy. I mean, largely men were the ones who went to sea, and so, but this Marilyn is such a strong character, and I wonder was there any conscious part of your process where you thought, like, I'm going to subvert some of these tropes of this kind of narrative, or did that just come about because of who she was and what the story was? Or
No,
maybe,
I mean,
maybe it's a mix of the two.
yeah, I think it's a mix of the two. But I do think, I know the moment I knew I wanted to try and write it as a book as opposed to just as a piece, or I don't know, I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but it was on finding his letters that he wrote later in life, which he self-published, and a lot of those are just sort of going over the same material and going over their sort of travels and journeys, but it's after she has sadly passed away, and he's sort of grief-stricken and very lonely again, and very introspective, and he is sort of tearing strips off himself as well. He has this sort of depressive cast of mind, and he's going round and round in circles and regretting things and regretting how he was, and it was just suddenly on the page getting the sense of a man who was so at odds with a kind of a swashbuckling hero, yeah, that, as you say, of that you might get in a kind of survival narrative or disaster narrative, and the more I read and the more I uncovered and read, found her diaries, the more this was sort of corroborated, I suppose, this sense of a man who was really at odds with himself and was such an anti-hero, and in some ways, and I get this sense from readers sometimes, kind of drives people crazy as well. He's an infuriating man in lots of ways, but that made me all the more fond of him and interested in him, I suppose. I think anything that complicates someone or complicates a picture is a good thing in my mind as a writer, that you want sort of human complexity, or you want to, you want the challenge of that, or doing justice to that. So, and then of course, he perfectly allows her to sort of rise to the sort of to the challenge, and to be the real hero of the story, and also he's the first one to credit her with that sort of status. He's the one that will always say that she was the one that kind of kept them going, kept them alive, and she quite effortlessly, I think in the sort of material that I had, just it became apparent the degree to which she was the driving force, not just there, or not just on the boat or on the raft, but like in all of their lives, and then it became, I guess, that was fruitful in its own way, right? Because it became a very interesting thing to think about, and a sad thing to think about, but interesting of I don't know how relationships work, and how we depend on each other, and the degree to which you're sort of propped up by someone, or you're propping up someone, and what you do when that sort of that prop is removed, and it all felt like interesting territory, I guess.
It really is. It's so fruitful. And, there were moments reading the book where I would kind of shake my head and think, like, I am such a Maurice. Like I had.
Me too. Me too. I hate to say it, but I mean, I got pretty down on myself in the process of writing this
Yeah,
book.
I can imagine like how that
Wishing
must.
I was more like Marilyn. Wishing.
Okay, I'm not alone in this, but yeah, I definitely had moments where I was like, oh God, like I know I would crumble in the same exact way. But since this is for booksellers and booksellers will be listening, I mean, you've done such a compelling job already pitching this book to us, and telling us the origin and everything. And I hope my enthusiasm is also conveying that to my fellow booksellers. I know that it did on the panel discussions for
Oh.
Indies Introduce. So if you were a bookseller, you're in a bookstore, and someone's asking for a recommendation, and this book is sitting on the table next to them. What is your quick elevator pitch? What is your hand sell for this book?
Okay. Well, I should say my first ever job was as an indie bookseller when I was 19 years old. So I have some, I mean, it was only for about 6 months, so I have brief experience. But I think I'd say, look, this is, on the surface, like one of the most insane and compelling kind of adventure and survival stories you'll read. But it hopefully offers more than that as well. That beneath the surface of that, you'll find like a whole intimate world, deeply intimate world of a relationship, and that there's much to discover there.
I would agree, and I would pick up the book after hearing you tell me that.
Yes.
Yeah, it truly is. I mean, it works on both the literal level because it is a true story that happened, and I mean, I think we've all felt at sea, both personally and in our relationships, and the sort of figurative level that it also, the meta way that it
Mm.
works, is also so compelling and really well done. And I feel like vicariously joyful that this book is getting this recognition already before it's even been published
Oh,
here. And you know, um, I know your editor at Riverhead who just was is so enthused about this, and so
oh,
yeah, like a lot of joy going around. And I think this book is going to be one that's going to find readers, and it's up to us as booksellers to make sure we get this into people's hands. So uh,
wow. I
thank you for
thank
it.
you for all your efforts in doing that. I appreciate it a huge amount.
Thank you for listening to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA site at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading!